are weakened and eventually can't survive as the ocean becomes too acid. So for several different reasons, we would argue that to keep a planet that looks like the one that's existed the last 10,000 years, we should try to keep CO2 no higher than 350 parts per million. Perhaps the optimum target is actually somewhat lower than that, but in any case, if we want to avoid large damaging effects, we need to keep CO2 less than 350 ppm. And the best way to evaluate this is to just look at the planet's energy balance. If it's out of balance by half a watt per meter squared, then we would need to reduce CO2 by about 30 or 35 ppm. If it's out of balance by 3/4 of a watt, we would actually need to take it back to something like 340 ppm if we want to restore energy balance, which is what you need to do if you want to stabilize the climate. But what that means is that we can't burn all the fossil fuels, because the CO2 that we put in the air by burning fossil fuels stays in the surface reservoirs. It distributes itself among the ocean, the atmosphere, and the biosphere and the soil, but it stays in these surface reservoirs for millennia before it's eventually deposited on the ocean floor as carbonates. So what it tells us is that if we just burn the remaining oil and gas, we could get CO2 to peak at something less than about 425 ppm if we would phase out the coal over the next few decades, and if we would leave the unconventional fossil fuels in the ground. Then CO2 would peak and begin to slowly decline. And if we had aggressive programs for reforestation and improved agriculture to store more carbon in the soil, we could get back to 350 ppm by the end of the century. But the requirement is that we'd have to phase out coal emissions quickly and not develop the unconventional fossil fuels. But what's actually happening? We're talking about building pipelines to carry tar sands oil to places. And we're continuing to build coal-fired power plants all around the world. And we compare, you know, up until the Kyoto Protocol, CO2 was increasing like 1.5% per year, or the CO2 emissions. Since then, they've been increasing about 3% per year. So despite the knowledge of the impact on climate, the emissions are actually increasing faster. So there's this huge gap between the rhetoric and the reality. The president says we have a planet in peril, and yet the policies are basically business as usual. The fundamental problem is that as long as fossil fuels are the cheapest energy, then we're going to keep using them. The reason that they're cheapest is because they get some subsidies, but that's not the main problem. The main problem is they don't pay their costs to society. Just the effect of fossil fuels on human health, where the air and water pollution is killing about 1 million people a year, maybe 50,000 in the United States. Those health costs are borne by the public, not by the fossil fuel industry. And the bigger effect on the long run is the climate change effects, which again, there's no charge to the fossil fuel industry for that. The cost will be borne by the public. So, there's another, so the fundamental thing is the only way we can solve the problem is to make the fossil fuels pay for their cost to society. That means you've got to add a price to the carbon emissions. But the other fundamental thing, which is almost as certain as the fact that we keep burning them as long as they're cheapest, and that's the fact the public is never going to allow you to put a large tax on emissions if the money is going to Congress and then gives it to their favorite lobbyist. So I argue that what we should do is add a fee to carbon across the board, oil, gas, coal, at the source, at the local domestic mine or the port of entry. It has to rise gradually over time. If it started at $15 a ton and goes up $10 a ton, and after 10 years it's $115 a ton, which is equal to $1 a gallon of gasoline. But that tax would generate $600 billion a year with the present use of fossil fuels, which if we distribute that to the public, an equal share to each legal adult resident and half a share to each child of 2 per family, that's between $2,000 and $3,000 per person per year, or $6,000 to $9,000 per family with 2 children or less. That would allow the people to begin to make the changes that they need to in order to reduce their carbon footprint. And in fact, 60% of the people will get more in the dividend than they pay in increased energy costs. But with the knowledge that that fee is going to continue to rise, they will begin to make changes, or they're going to end up on the short end of the stick. But that knowledge that the fee is going to go up would cause all kinds of innovations. So if the business community knew that was really going to happen, we would have all kinds of changes, and we could move to a clean energy economy, which we're going to have to do anyway. Fossil fuels are finite, so we're going to have to find clean energies in the long run. And the cap-and-trade, the things that Congress talks about, they're talking, you know, our Congress is well-oiled and cool-fired. And when they try to design a system, it's basically one which suits the lobbyists, the big banks, and the fossil fuel industry. But what we need is one that's designed for the public. And it's also, you know, cap-and-trade, which is what they talked about. There's no way to make cap-and-trade global. There's no chance that China will accept a cap on their economy. They've flat out said that, and there's no reason that they should. Their contribution to the excess CO2 in the atmosphere is 10 times smaller than that of the United States on a per capita basis. We're responsible for 27%, and they're responsible for 9%, and they've got 3 times as many people. But they have every reason to put a price on carbon because they don't want to be addicted to fossil fuels the way the United States is. And they would suffer from climate change more than most places. They have 300 million people living near sea level. They also have heavy air and water pollution. And they're smart enough to know that the countries that get out in front in the clean energy technology are going to be the ones who have it to sell to the rest of the world. And I don't want you to try to read this, but this is something written by Jim DePaso, who is, I think, Executive Secretary for Republicans for the Environment. And he says that this proposal that I just discussed makes use of market principles by prodding the market to tell the truth about the costs of carbon-based energy through prices. It would not impose mandates on consumers or businesses. It would not create new government agencies or add a penny to Uncle Sam's coffers. Fee and dividend, how would it affect individuals? That would depend on how they exercise their right to make free choices. Businesses would seek out more opportunities to improve their energy efficiency. Other businesses would sell products and services that enable them to do so. Low carbon energy sources would be more competitive in with high carbon sources. And he says it's transparent, market-based, does not create government, does not enlarge government, leaves energy decisions to individual choices, takes a better safe than sorry approach to throttling back on heat-trapping gases. Sounds like a conservative climate plan. But the problem is that we are up against people who prefer to continue business as usual. They're making a lot of money out of it, and they're a lot more, they seem to be a lot more effective at communicating with the public than scientists are. So what we end up with is a case of potential intergenerational injustice. Way back, the Founding Fathers, Thomas Jefferson talked about the responsibility of the current generation to leave. He was a farmer, and he said, you can't deplete the soils. You have to leave soils that are in equally productive condition for the next generation. And that concept of obligation to future generations is held by most cultures around the world. But yet, the fact is, so here's my son's first child, Jake, and their second child, Lauren. Jake is 2.5 years old. He's very large for his age. He's in the top 1%. He may be 2 meters high when he grows up, according if you believe long extrapolations. He thinks that he can protect his baby sister, but what Jake doesn't know is that we're probably, or we're in the process of leaving a situation which is going to be out of their control. And now here's Jake's baby sister at age 7 months. You can see she's pretty serious. She's already wondering about what sort of situation we're leaving. So her cousin, Sophie, who's now, in this photo, 12 years old, she's now getting close to 13, but she decided she's writing a letter to President Obama. And you can tell from the look on her face that she thinks I'm going to like her letter. Because, among other things, she says, why don't you listen to my grandmother? So here we are celebrating her letter. Now let me end on a couple of notes of optimism. China, I think, I was in China several months ago, and it seems clear to me that they do not, first of all, they don't deny the science. They accept that the country is basically run by engineers. And they are now making enormous investments in clean energy. And they're now #1 in producing solar panels and producing windmills, and they're building 30 nuclear power plants. So we're going to have to take a look at that, or we're going to soon end up as a second-rate nation if we don't start doing some of those things ourselves. But the other thing is, there's potential for a legal approach. I argue that in our Declaration of Independence, it first starts out saying all people are created equal, and then in the Constitution, there's on the basis of that concept, there's the equal protection of the laws, which was used in the case of civil rights for the courts to tell the executive branch of the government it needs to enforce equal opportunity, and in the schools and other places. So hopefully the judicial branch will be willing to look at this issue, because there is precedent for the concept that the atmosphere and climate, the planet, are really held as a public trust for future generations. And they may be able to force the government to begin to take some of the steps to stabilize climate. And you can read some of the things I've written about this on these websites. Thanks.